He received his Ph.D. at the University of Virginia in 71. Just a little background for you. He serves as an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, where his research on cloned human stem cells provided a radically new understanding of the mechanisms controlling life. He resigned his tenured position. As you may know, a tenured position is not something one normally resigns. It is something to be sought. But he wanted to pursue independent research, integrating quantum physics with cell biology. He returned to academia as a research scientist at Stanford University School of Medicine to test his hypotheses from 1987 to 1992. His revolutionary studies, and they are revolutionary, on the mechanics of mind-body interactions unify the practices of conventional medicine, complementary medicine, and spiritual healing. His insights have made him internationally sought after for lecture, and his informative new book, The Biology of Belief, Unleashing the Power of Consciousness, Matter, and Miracles, is available now, and I am reading it slowly and trying to absorb it all. And it's not easy. Dr. Lipton, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, John.
Well, we have a good deal to talk about and a good bit of time to talk about it in. So where would you like to begin? How I must know the how and the why. What motivated you to go into eventually cellular biology?
Well, actually, it was interesting because it was actually in second grade when I first saw cells in a microscope, and I saw them moving around this little amoeba and this little paramecium, and in my child's mind, I saw that these cells weren't just like pinballs bouncing around in a machine. They were actually looking for something over here and backing up and looking for something over there. And I caught on that these were like little people. And it just, it was interesting because the world wasn't that wonderful at that particular time. And so this new world that I saw in there was it just drew me in. And I didn't realize it. It drew me in so deep that I ended up becoming an electron microscopist about 25 years later or something like that. And it was real exciting because what I saw on that very first day turned out to be real, that these cells are very intelligent, and it's interesting because as a biologist and teaching in a medical school, there's always a tendency to look down at anything less than human as not being that intelligent. And to me, the biggest shock is that when I learned the lessons of these cells, it was so profoundly important, a message of understanding how to live, that my life was radically changed when I started to apply what the cells were teaching. And then I stand back and say to people, well, we look at them as not being intelligent, but the interesting reality is when we look at our human bodies and we look in the mirror, we see this singular entity. So, John, you see John in the mirror, I see Bruce in the mirror, all of our listeners see themselves as this one entity. And it's very interesting because that's actually a misperception. And the fact is that if I would shrink you down to the size of a cell, that you would see your body is actually made out of about 50 trillion sentient little beings, these little cells. They're the living things. And so that our bodies actually represent communities of living cells. And when you start to understand this, then you start to realize that they created technologies that we haven't even thought about yet, that inside this world under your skin, these 50 trillion or so cells are living in a technological environment that's beyond anything we've ever seen. They filter the air, they filter the water. Every cell has health care. There's maintenance. It's a living system. It's a metropolis. And very interesting is that there's always that spiritual historic look that said the answers lie within. And in fact, I realize now that is, in a biological sense, a very profound truth, because we're trying to put together a planet here with 6 to 8 billion people and finding that we're destroying ourselves and the planet like crazy. And we're trying to find out how to create this wonderful life. And there, underneath our skin, is this giant community of 50 trillion individual sentient beings. And I say that because in cloning cells, I would take cells out of people and put them in petri dishes, and they have their own intelligence and their own ability to create their own world in that petri dish, because every cell is intelligent. And that in our bodies, these cells have the intelligence to create all of the functions that we express: respiration, digestion, excretion, the nervous system, converting the world into experience. This is all a mechanization created by cells. So when we look at ourselves, inside there are clues, in the sense that if we can understand how an economy is maintained, and they make energy, they distribute energy equivalent to money, they have jobs, every cell has a job, that there are rules and regulations, and the thing is, when that works, and those communities are working in harmony, the individual experiences a bliss or an ecstasy on this planet because of this wonderful harmony of 50 trillion cells. And the fact is, God, if you can get 50 trillion cells to live in harmony, we're just trying to get a few billion people to live together. It's like there's a lot of lessons to be learned from this cellular community. And as I mentioned, some of these lessons were so profound, they changed my entire life. So we could talk about some of the lessons or other experiences from that. I'm open to your suggestion.
I watched your DVD, your lecture on DVD, with great interest. In fact, I watched it several times. So this is going to be, for me, this is a little like the monkey flying the rocket ship, and I'm the monkey. So here's the thing: it's so rich, it's unbelievable. The first part of your lecture went into just a very easily understandable explanation of what the prior knowledge was in regard to cellular activity, the roles that the genes played, and the chromosomes, and then eventually it went on to say, look, these somebody gets a disease, a gene must have turned itself on, a cancer gene has turned itself on, and you went on to explain that no, genes don't turn themselves on, something turns them on, and it was wonderful. So just take us through it and lead us to the light. Let us know.
I so
what's
appreciate
happening.
that because, as I said, when I really understood this, and it was interesting, so I could tell people right now before we get into this a little bit deeper, is that there's this understanding that the cells provide about who we are and our place in the world and a destination that we can create. And it's very interesting because if we apply these lessons to our lives, they profoundly change the character of our lives. And I say that because I'm a student of this. I went into this study not a spiritual person. I was teaching, as you mentioned, I was teaching medical school. I was teaching about biochemicals and the concept that you mentioned about genes controlling life. And I was a participant in the teaching and obviously, a member of the congregation, so to speak, and buying all this stuff. And so what was interesting is that as I started getting into understanding the lessons that the cells were teaching me, they provided me with this other understanding, and that is that there's more to us than this physical body, and that this other transcendent part, there's a spiritual component. And it was just like, I wasn't looking for it, but boy, when it hit like a ton of bricks. It was like, oh my God, there's more to the cells, that the information that the cells are responding to comes from outside in the environment. Our identities are outside in the environment. And my point about bringing all this up is that I'm going to talk about this information, and I can tell you it can change your life, but you also have to. We also have to come to this understanding. So as I download this information, so to speak, that we recognize that it's applying the information that makes all the difference in the world. And I say that because I was up in the front of people when this breakthrough understanding of how cells actually work came to me. I was so out there in the street trying to get anybody to listen, say, listen, you got to see this completely different than anything we ever thought, that we have powers beyond anything we've ever thought, and you could understand this, you could create this beautiful life. And I'd be giving this lecture so excited because I knew all this scientific stuff, and it was interesting because the audience would later cock their heads and look at me and go, Lipton, for a guy who says he knows a lot, your life doesn't look that good. And I realized that, oh my God, there was two parts to this. There's a part of knowing about the details, and then the most important part, which I didn't do at that time, was apply this information to my life, so that there was the original thought that if you just know about something, then that becomes your life, and I realized that's not true. And so let's get into this exciting part here, and that is, what controls life? And as you mentioned, I was led into this understanding of genes by history because there was perceptions and beliefs of scientists that were shaped over time. And one of the first pieces of information that shaped our understanding of heredity and genetics was from Charles Darwin. And Darwin brought to people an understanding that was so obvious, but they just needed to see it, and that was this. The question of biology is what controls life. And what he looked at, and he said, the traits of a child are derived from the traits of the parents. That whatever characters a child's expressing, you could see these characters in the parents. And based on a Newtonian world, a universe made out of matter and chemicals, it was believed that the character of life, that whatever is being passed from parent to child that controls the character of life must be something physical in those germ cells, in those eggs and sperm. So the direction was already set by Darwin. He said, if you want to understand what controls life, identify this element that's in the germ cell that in some way controls heredity. He had no idea of genes, but he knew there was something in there that controlled it. And it was obvious because the kids had the characters of the parents. So that got people looking in the germ cells. In about 1892, chromosomes were discovered. And they said, they looked at these chromosomes and they appear just before the cell divides, and that they showed irregularities of the chromosomes were associated with irregularities in the organism, and they started to put the pieces together and say, that's that stuff. In that chromosome, that's the stuff that controls life, because that's what they were looking for. And they found that the chromosome had two components, proteins and DNA. And they said, geez, one of these things must be the one that controls life. And they didn't know which one. And it was as late as 1945, they still didn't know what controlled life. So it wasn't that long ago, really. Up to 1945, they weren't sure, proteins or the DNA. And an experiment was done by three guys, Avery, McLeod, McCarty, in 1945. And what they did is they took a chromosome from one species of bacteria and split it up into DNA and to the protein. And in a different species, they added in one set of dishes the protein from the chromosome, and in another set of dishes the DNA, and said, well, if one of these changes the fate, then from the species they isolated the DNA from would change the character of the species they put the DNA in the tissue culture. And sure enough, they found that the DNA changed the traits of the bacteria and the protein didn't. So in 1945, the answer was DNA controls life. 9 years later, Watson and Crick, and we have, I remember as a youngster, the paper, the New York tabloid, big front page, black, no picture even that day, just big black print, Secret of Life discovered. And that was sort of the biggest turning point in biology, because they said, we got the answers. It's DNA, and DNA controls life. And they created what is called the central dogma. And it's interesting because as a teacher in the university, I was teaching the central dogma, which was formulated by Francis Crick, the guy who was like Watson and Crick, the DNA guys. And Francis Crick came up with this assumption that after 100 years, they already had a belief system, and now he spelled it out. He said that DNA is the hereditary molecule, the gene, and that's converted into RNA, which is like a Xerox copy. And the Xerox copy, the RNA, is a blueprint to make the proteins. And the proteins are the molecules that give your body its structure and its function. So the character of the proteins is controlled by the DNA, and everybody was happy, and it was called the central dogma. It says DNA controls life, and we bought into it. And we bought into it that genes determine life, and that there are good genes, there are bad genes, and that your life was predetermined in a sense at the moment of conception, so that whatever genes you got from your mother and your father, they sorted themselves out, a selection of them was made, and that selection was sort of like a fate map, that for the rest of your life, that these genes were going to determine your structure, your behavior, all the characters of your life. And so we bought into that, and what that did is that this concept called genetic determinism was a piece of knowledge that brought us to the belief that we are victims, that we're victims of heredity, that things are passed down in your family, and they come from your generation after generation. These genes are passed down, and that these genes are going to express themselves in your life, and you're going to have those traits that were passed down, so that when you look and somebody says, oh, my goodness, my father died when he was 52, and my grandfather died when he was 48, and I'm 46. Geez, I'm in a lot of trouble because I only got a couple of years left here. Or cancer, my aunt had the cancer, and my grandmother had the cancer, and my sister had the cancer, and it's like, oh my God, I have genes for cancer. And what we bought into is victimization. And the issue about this is why it's very critical is very simply this, is that presumably we didn't pick the genes that we have in our bodies. We can't change the genes that we have in our bodies. The genes control who we are, so we are, in a sense, powerless. And with that powerless belief thrust upon us, there's a general tendency for us to become more irresponsible, think, well, you can't do anything about it, so who even cares now at this point? And this whole malaise has led to this current status of health where we're all so afraid that our lives are out of our control, that things like bacteria can kill us, and we're afraid of the avian flu, and we're afraid of these genes turning on. And while all of that was going on, there was this big idea called the Human Genome Project. And the Human Genome Project was, and it's interesting because there's two sides to the story. There's the public side of the story, and that was this. Let's do a Human Genome Project, and what we'll do is we'll identify all of the genes that make up a human, and then when we have all these genes, if anybody has a problem, we could genetically engineer them and fix their problems, and this was going to be the last biology project, and salvation was coming, utopia, you could fix anything now.
And then
that's
what
the
happened?
Surface view. What's that?
And then what happened?
And then the cosmic joke. And the cosmic joke was just so exciting because by then I'd already resigned from the university because before the project got started, I thought, oh my God, genes don't control this thing. And yet the momentum was on. They were doing the project. And the interesting aspect underlying is that the Human Genome Project was actually created by venture capitalists. And what they had envisioned was that they would patent the genes and then sell the patents to the drug industry.
Why am I not surprised at this? This stuff is so complex. But you're making it sound a lot less complex, and I'm trying to hang with you. This thing about, is it heredity or environment that controls the development of humans? That goes all the way back. That argument goes all the way back to the Three Stooges I used to watch when I was a kid, which my parents didn't approve of, but I did it anyway.
Well, so, I guess they had something running in that family as of the Stooges anyway, didn't it?
yeah, they were brilliant for sure. But, all right. Now move us along into the practical application of this knowledge. We are not stuck with our genes. Genes do not turn themselves on. We are not predestined to have these things happen to us.
Well, this is what happened with that genome project is that it failed. But the failure is a turning point for human civilization because the failure revealed a belief system that was maintained for 100 years was totally flawed, and that was the belief system that genes control life. Because in order to make that work, the scientists had already predicted they must have over 150,000 genes to make a human, and when the genome results were reported, there were about 25,000 genes. So there was like over 100,000 genes were missing, which meant they had a complete misunderstanding about how it worked. And it was interesting because I had already, in my own cloning studies with cells, started to get a completely different understanding because it revealed, firstly, this. In many of the experiments I did, they were involving enucleation, meaning taking the nucleus out of a cell, and the nucleus has all the genes. Well, the fundamental belief system, genes control life. And here I am working with cells where you remove the genes, and the cells still have lives. Many cells can live 2 or more months with no genes in it. And the cells aren't just sitting there. They're moving around. They're digesting food, breathing, excreting waste, communicating with other cells, avoiding toxins. They're having a life. And the fact is there are no genes. And all of a sudden at some point you have to stop and say, well, what's controlling the cell in the absence of genes? Because our whole belief system said that genes made all the control.
Well, what is the control mechanism?
Well, the control mechanism happens to be what the subject of the book is about, is that what's the brain of the cell, and it turns out it's not the nucleus with the genes, but it's the skin, which also, when we understand the nature that a human is made in the image of the cell, it also then makes sense out of our embryology because our brain is derived from our skin as well. And what's interesting is that, while the brain is the skin, the control actually comes from the environment. And I saw this when early on with those cloning studies, where I would take my cells, and these were stem cells, which, interestingly enough, all of us out there in the audience, all of us have stem cells. And the stem cells are like embryonic cells that are scattered through your body right now, no matter what age you are. And that these stem cells, when instructed to do so, will actually repair and replace our body parts, so that we shouldn't really age in the way that we age at all, because these stem cells are there to continuously nourish and regenerate our cells and tissues. And interestingly enough, we've been given the belief that, well, like God gave you the stem cells, but no way to use them, and that's why we're waiting for the pharmaceutical company to figure out how to make them work. And that's like a joke, because the reality is, well, we all have stem cells. There's a question, why aren't they working? And this is what I found. When I was culturing the stem cells, and I was culturing a type that normally, under the conditions we use, form muscle. So I put the stem cells in a petri dish, put them with that environment inside the incubator, and come back, and they form these big contractile muscle colonies. But I found if I changed the environment and put the same cells in a petri dish with a different environment and moved it over into a different incubator, that these cells would form bone. And then I found if I took the very same cells and put them in a third environment, in another environment with gas and different incubator environment, and I put them in a petri dish, that the same cells now would form fat cells. And all of a sudden it hit me way back in the 70s. I said, oh my goodness, all the cells are exactly the same, but the fate of what the cells do is not determined by the genes. They all have the same genes. It's determined by the environment. And I started to realize, as I changed the environment, then I changed the behavior and character of the cells. And, a simple thing like this. If I took my petri dish and put it in a good, healthy environment, the cells divide, they grow, the cultures form, and they thrive, and they do everything just right. If I take the same cells and put them in a less than optimum culture environment, the cells begin to stop growing, they start to get sick, they even start to die. But if I take them back out of that bad environment, put them back into the good environment, immediately they would recover.
Now, I don't want to distract you with this question, but I have to jump in with this. If cells are actually, it sounds like they're miniature humans. It sounds that they're complete little entities unto themselves.
Absolutely. They do everything a human can do, a cell can do.
Well, let me ask you this then. And if you don't want to go out here, it's okay. Just go, no, John, don't go out there on that limb. It'll snap off and you'll fall. But is it possible then that if these cells, by changing their environment, actually produce different things, does that suggest, sociologically speaking, that if you take, this is a real crude example, forgive me if it's overly crude, but I have to try this. If you take an urban thug and you change his environment and you are able to observe changes, are those changes real? In other words, somebody was just checked out. The state checked him out recently in California. And my understanding is this person had written a children's book and had completely reformed and was not his murderous self that he was when he went in. Is it possible that this character had, in fact, actually changed? Absolutely.
It's an absolute understanding, and people can have epiphanies and change their lives in the middle of the afternoon and go somewhere else. And there are people who are lying in a cancer situation, terminal, in a deathbed, everybody looking around at them, and they change their mind. They get up, they walk away from that bed, and they have a spontaneous remission. The fact is, it's the cell and the human's ability to change their understanding of the environment, and through that change their biology, and as a result completely and profoundly change their lives. And why this is so important is that most of us seem to be afflicted to some degree with some kind of problem. I mean, so many people are on so many medications in this country, and healthcare is just overwhelmed with sick people can't wake up, can't go to sleep, all kinds of issues. And everybody's thinking, well, my God, look at all these frail human biology bodies. And the fact is, it turns out with our new understanding, it's not the genetics and biochemistry of the body that's the problem for most of the issues that we face, including cardiovascular disease and cancer. Most of the issues we face are the way we interact with the environment. And that if we change our interaction with the environment, we profoundly change our genetic expression and our biology and our fate. And this is very important because this is where the power comes from. And our old belief system, the one that's actually most people are taught, even in school today, is that we're victims. You know, it's just like, that's your fate. This is a criminal. He must, he's got bad genes or whatever it is. It's like, no, that the gene and the expression of the organism will change with the perception of the environment. So as people change the way they see the environment, they can change their biology actually virtually instantaneously.
Let me see if I can tie this together here. It may not work, but I'm going to try it. I just got an interesting email here from Peggy, who wanted to know, can you discuss your present research regarding the dream state? Is the dream state in any way a temporary environment which could affect change in the cellular whatever?
Yes. Okay, I would look at the dream state from now, because we're standing on that very thin branch.
I'm sorry,
it might be on thin air, but I stand from this point of view from a way that I see life now other than the way I saw it before. Based on the new biology, I see that we're not actually inside the cells, that we're a source, an identity outside the cells, that we're an energy, that we're a field, and that this invisible field, in science you can talk about quantum mechanics and energy fields, or in religion you can talk about spirit, same thing. And the reality is, I think that when we're in the dream state, that we're actually not connected to the body at that time. And as a result, we're in this field of knowing. And the idea is that you can acquire perceptions in a dream. And since perceptions change the way your cells respond to the environment, if this dream is profound enough and your perceptions are changed in some way in that dream state, that this could carry over and change your biology when you're in your body state.
Well, from a health standpoint, we're encouraged to take enough sleep to be actually able to go deep enough to get into the dream state, because dreaming is healthy.
Absolutely. So, it's actually partly healthy in one sense, is that we get out of the body long enough so that the cells can do all the routine maintenance to cover up for all the damage we've done during the day. And that's because basically we're living so out of balance that we're taxing our systems, and the illnesses and diseases that are primary out there are just due to the concept of stressing the biology. It's we always try to blame every disease and pathology on a virus, a germ, a bad gene, and stuff like that. And yet the literature totally reveals that the greatest majority of illness faced by people is not anything physical. It's just in operating the body without really knowing that the stresses that we put on every day are just physically demanding and are affecting the body in such a way that we're destroying ourselves by the way we drive the vehicle, in a sense. You
have just given me a great impetus for the next bunch of questions that I want to ask you on the other side of this break. But I got to ask you a question.
Yes.
Well, let me put it another way. I take it that large drug companies probably don't back you.
Well, that's an understatement if I've heard one, yeah.
Oh, I appreciate that.
And basically, it's because they're keeping us enslaved with a belief system of a mechanized body in a quantum physics universe that emphasizes energy. It's like, no, we're not physical bodies, we're energy bodies, and the idea is you can heal with the energy much more effectively than you can with the chemicals. And in fact, it's a known fact that medicine is essentially the leading cause of death, not because it's not medical bashing, it's not the doctor's fault. It's actually the people like myself are at fault, that the academics that were teaching doctors, because we're not providing them with the current up-to-date information. And the reason why is simply that there's a bias impressed upon medicine by the pharmaceutical corporations. And that is, medicine doesn't talk about the role of energy at all in the concept of healing, and basically ignores that it exists, even though this is an established understanding by physics for nearly 100 years. And why is it important is because it's not biology's choice to ignore energy. It's not. It's like they just say, no, just focus on the chemicals, and that means the drugs. And the issue about that is that every science 25 years later or something like that, and it was real exciting because what I saw on that very first day turned out to be real, that these cells are very intelligent, and it's interesting because as a biologist and teaching in a medical school, there's always a tendency to look down at anything less than human as not being that intelligent. And to me, the biggest shock is that when I learned the lessons of these cells, it was so profoundly important, a message of understanding how to live, that my life was radically changed when I started to apply what the cells were teaching. And then I stand back and say to people, well, we look at them as not being intelligent, but the interesting reality is when we look at our human bodies, and we look in the mirror, we see this singular entity. So, John, you see John in the mirror. I see Bruce in the mirror. All of our listeners see themselves as this one entity. And it's very interesting because that's actually a misperception. And the fact is that if I would shrink you down to the size of a cell, that you would see your body is actually made out of about 50 trillion sentient little beings.
And it's not easy. Dr. Lipton, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, John.
Well, we have a good deal to talk about and a good bit of time to talk about it in. So where would you like to be in? How I must know the how and the why. What motivated you to go into eventually cellular biology?
Well, actually, it was interesting because it was actually in second grade when I first saw cells in a microscope, and I saw them moving around, this little amoeba and this little paramecium, and in my child's mind, I saw that these cells weren't just like pinballs bouncing around in a machine. They were actually looking for something over here and backing up and looking for something over there, and I caught on that these were like little people. And it just, it was interesting because the world wasn't that wonderful at that particular time. And so this new world that I saw in there was it just drew me in. And I didn't realize it. It drew me in so deep that I ended up becoming an electron microscopist about individual sentient beings. And I say that because in cloning cells, I would take cells out of people and put them in petri dishes. And they have their own intelligence and their own ability to create their own world in that petri dish because every cell is intelligent, and that in our bodies, these cells have the intelligence to create all of the functions that we express: respiration, digestion, excretion, the nervous system, converting the world into experience. This is all a mechanization created by cells. So when we look at ourselves, inside there are clues in the sense that if we can understand how an economy is maintained, and they make energy, they distribute energy equivalent to money, they have jobs, every cell has a job, that there are rules and regulations, and the thing is, when that works, and those communities are working in harmony, the individual experiences a bliss or an ecstasy on this planet because of this wonderful harmony of 50 trillion cells. And the fact is, God, if you can get 50 little cells, they're the living things. And so that our bodies actually represent communities of living cells. And when you start to understand this, then you start to realize that they created technologies that we haven't even thought about yet, that inside this world under your skin, these 50 trillion or so cells are living in a technological environment that's beyond anything we've ever seen. They filter the air, they filter the water. Every cell has health care. There's maintenance. It's a living system. It's a metropolis. And very interesting is that there's always that spiritual, historic look that said the answers lie within. And in fact, I realize now that is, in a biological sense, a very profound truth, because we're trying to put together a planet here with 6 to 8 billion people and finding that we're destroying ourselves and the planet like crazy. And we're trying to find out how to create this wonderful life. And there, underneath our skin, is this giant community of 50 trillion.
He received his Ph.D. at the University of Virginia in 71. Just a little background for you. He serves as an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine, where his research on cloned human stem cells provided a radically new understanding of the mechanisms controlling life. He resigned his tenured position. As you may know, a tenured position is not something one normally resigns. It is something to be sought. But he wanted to pursue independent research, integrating quantum physics with cell biology. He returned to academia as a research scientist at Stanford University School of Medicine to test his hypotheses from 1987 to 1992. His revolutionary studies, and they are revolutionary, on the mechanics of mind-body interactions unify the practices of conventional medicine, complementary medicine, and spiritual healing. His insights have made him internationally sought after for lecture, and his informative new book, The Biology of Belief, Unleashing the Power of Consciousness, Matter, and Miracles, is available now, and I am reading it slowly and trying to absorb it all.